the youngest of the Martineau clan. And when you're the youngest of 12 siblings, it's hard to get a word in edgewise. But he rose to the challenge, and today he teaches speech and debate, and he's a very excellent orator. He will perform an original oration for all of us tonight.
I never seem to beat my sisters at singing, so I figured I'd better speak instead. You know, childhood, for me, as I imagine it is for many people, was a magical time, full of carefree days and imagination. But it was not all fun and games for little Sammy Martineau, I'll tell you. No. As a child, I did have one heavy burden to bear, and that was that I got hurt every single day. And I hated it because it was no fair. Whether it was stepping on a stick in my bare feet, or bonking my head on my bunk bed, or stepping on a rock in my bare feet, or crashing into a tetherball pole, or stepping on a thorn in my bare feet, or, you know, crashing on my rollerblades, or stepping on a peach pit in my bare feet. I got hurt every day. And I did not wear shoes very often. And so I had a dream. I wished, and I imagine that I'm not the only child who ever wished this, that I could simply not feel pain. I mean, I wondered what the point of having feet even was, if every time you stepped on something it was going to hurt. And I just knew, I knew that my life would be much better if I could simply stop getting hurt. But what I did not know was that approximately 2,000 miles away, there was another little boy growing up 3 years older than myself in Washington State, who, lucky dog, was living my dream. Though for him it was a little less, I don't know, dreamlike than I may have imagined as a child. Steve Pete was born with congenital analgesia, which was a disorder that makes the person literally immune to pain. As a child, I would have imagined that this would mean that he would grow up free from the constraints of head bonks and foot pokes. But for him, it really mostly meant that he grew up in a cast. Because you see, Steve Pete did not and still does not have the early warning system that is pain. And so severe bone breaks were a fairly frequent occurrence for him as a child. Try as his parents might, they simply could not teach him, as well as pain could, what would hurt his body and what would not. As a teething toddler, he chewed off a part of his tongue. As a child, he frequently suffered cuts, burns, breaks. And as an adult, he now suffers from many long-term health problems as a result of the multitude of injuries he has suffered throughout his life. Steve Pete still lives in Washington State and now runs an organization dedicated to connecting the people who suffer from congenital analgesia and helping them deal with the psychological effects of having that illness.
Mommy, honestly.
Now, when I was a child, I probably would have happily changed places with Steve Pete. And you know, I'll bet you he would have happily changed places with me. But one of us would have been wiser than the other, because one of us, through painful experience, had come to understand and appreciate the great gift of pain. You know, I'm probably not the only person who has failed to appreciate the gift of pain in all of its multifacets, because sometimes suffering just looks like suffering. For example, a child who has just got a bee sting doesn't generally say, "What can I learn from this experience?" He usually says, because it hurts. Likewise, when any person experiences pain, physical, emotional, or otherwise, it can be difficult to discern the gifts it is offering to us. But just because lessons are difficult to see does not mean that they are not being offered. And just because gifts can be difficult to detect does not mean that they're being handed to us. Take, for example, the life of the famous character from the classic work of English literature, Jane Eyre, Mr. Edward Rochester. In this book, Edward Rochester is born to great wealth and education and privilege, but his father wishes to extend the family fortune, and so he pushes Edward into a marriage in a very wealthy family, but hides from him the history of insanity in the family, so that a few years after his marriage, Edward finds himself with a passed away father, a very wealthy man, and the husband to a very insane wife. In this experience, Edward does not perceive a great opportunity for virtue. Instead, he just sees pain. And so he determines that he will hide his wife away, pretend that he has never been married, and seek love again. He spends years traveling the continent, looking for the shadows of the life that he's lost, and then returns home disappointed, only there to find Jane. And he falls in love with Jane. But why he falls in love with Jane is one of the great stories of this book. He falls in love with Jane not because she is beautiful or wealthy or vivacious, like many of the women who have pursued him. He falls in love with Jane because she is good. Specifically because she is good where he is not. But what he fails to understand is that the goodness which he so admires in Jane has been the product of lessons learned on her part in a very difficult and painful life. Consequently, when he proposes to her, he cannot, as he wishes and pretends to, enter into this relationship on equal moral grounds. Indeed, he is Jane's far moral inferior. But there is redemption ahead for Edward Rochester, and it comes in the form of pain. On their wedding day, Edward Rochester's true position is revealed, and later Jane leaves him, though he begs her to stay. And then his wife burns down his estate. Throughout these experiences, Rochester experiences a great deal of suffering, but he is given something even greater, an opportunity for redemption. In the blaze in his estate, he rushes in a great redemptive act to save his insane wife, whose death he would have done nothing but wish for only a few days prior. In the failed attempt, he loses a hand, he loses his sight, but what he gains is much greater than anything that he lost. Through having his duplicitous advances to Jane painfully exposed, through seeing her leave him, not because she wants to, but because she knows it's right, and through losing his estate and his sight, he gains a portion of the moral fortitude which he admires in Jane, and which should be of much greater worth to him than a false marriage ever could be. In this case, the blind truly begin to see. This work of literature is, of course, fiction, but like all great works, it serves as a mirror to the soul. Much like Edward Rochester, when experiencing pain or difficulty, the natural reaction is to find the quickest way away from the suffering and to bemoan the caprice of fate against us, instead of being grateful for the opportunity to learn lessons that we either never would have taught ourselves or never would have been able to teach ourselves on our own. Edward Rochester would never have been willing to teach himself virtue because it went contrary to his desires. And so he needed painful experience. As a child, I never could have taught myself caution. And so I needed painful experience. And all of us do not know what we do not know. And the way we will come to know it is through blessed pain. Some of the pain that we feel is the cost of extracting a thorn from our lives, like Rochester. Some of the pain that we feel is the price to receive guidance that we do not want, like Jonah. Some of the pain we feel is the cost paid by every entrepreneur, leader, and parent to travel from a land of inexperience to a land of wisdom. Some of the pain we feel is the cost of finding that our dreams are only windmills like Don Quixote. Some of the pain that we feel is the holy cost to learn compassion. And some of the pain we feel, we just don't understand at all until we see what it has done for us later. Francis Webster and his wife Anne Elizabeth Webster in 1856 planned to travel by wagon on the Mormon Trail to Zion with other pioneers. But seeing other would-be pioneers in London who couldn't pay their own way, they decided to travel by handcart instead and pay for 9 others to go by handcart as well. But when they arrived in America in 1856, the handcarts that they had arranged for were not ready, and so the beginning of their trek was delayed. As a result of their compassion and love, Francis and Anne Webster had the opportunity to travel in the Martin Handcart Company, whose deprivation and loss on the Mormon Trail has been well documented. Of the experience, Francis Webster said, "I have been so tired from illness and lack of food, I could not put one foot in front of the other. I have looked ahead and I've seen a patch of sand or a hill slope and said, I must go there and stop, for I cannot pull the load through. I've got to that patch of sand, and my cart has started pushing me. And I have looked behind many times to see who was pushing my cart, and saw no one. It was then that I knew that the angels of God were with us. Was I sorry that I chose to come by handcart? No. Not then, or any minute since. The price that we paid to become acquainted with God was a privilege to pay. And I'm thankful that I had the privilege to come in the Martin Handcart Company. Privilege is not a word often associated with painful experience, but perhaps we would be more wise if it were. I can tell you that in retrospect, many of the experiences for which I'm most grateful have been opportunities for me to look at myself in the mirror and say, Sam, look at the mess you've made. And in my better moments, I might even have the courage, in the midst of a trial, to recognize that I am walking paths that I am privileged to tread. Now, you know, Sammy Martineau, he didn't think too much of pain. But he was going to experience some in his life anyway, and all of us will. You might even say that every one of us is going to experience something painful every single day. But not everyone is going to gain equal benefit from the lessons offered in those painful experiences. And whether they end up leaving us bitter, like Sammy Martineau, or better, like Edward Rochester or Francis Webster, may indeed be the result of how we choose to appreciate them. Thank you.